Welcome to our lunch forum, our spring series on digital technology and humanities scholarship. This is a continuation of our forum series from the fall. The idea grew out of our work developing the Townsend Humanities Lab website. I'm Colin Dingler. I'm a graduate student in rhetoric, and I'm also one of the developers of the Townsend Humanities Lab website project. So the goal of these forums is to introduce humanists to aspects of what is broadly called the digital humanities. And we hope to start conversations with experts who work on issues that have some bearing on the future of arts and humanities scholarship. Before I give the microphone over to our speaker, I want to let you know that there will be two more of these forums in the spring. One will be on March 8th and one on April 15th. And we're passing around an email sign-up sheet, so if you can get your name on that, we'll be sure to make sure that you get a email announcement in case you're not already on one of the lists that we use to broadcast these events. Today we're honored to have Pamela Samuelson, who is a Chancellor's Professor of Information Management and of Law here at UC Berkeley, as well as a Director of the Berkeley Center for Law and Technology, and an advisor to the Samuelson High Technology Law and Public Policy Clinic at Bolt Hall. And she has written, taught, and spoken extensively about the challenges that new information technologies pose for traditional legal regimes, especially for intellectual property law. This is only a partial list of her many accomplishments, which also include having been a MacArthur Fellow and serving on the board of directors at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Professor Samuelson will be talking about the Google Book Search settlement and its effects on academic publishing. After the talk, our format is to open up the floor to audience discussion. So if you can hold off your questions until she's done, then you'll have a chance to ask them afterwards. So please join me in welcoming Professor Samuelson.
Thank you for coming. It's really very good to have a group of people to talk to about what has become one of my favorite subjects. So I'm going to try to situate you quickly through kind of how did we get to this proposed settlement, and then I want to talk a little bit about why, as an academic author and as an academic researcher, even though I benefit, like many of the rest of us, with a greater access to books that Book Search promises, I nonetheless had quite a few reservations about the settlement details. So I'll kind of give you a flavor about kind of what the settlement is about, what some of the other objections are, but I'm mostly going to focus on what the academic community, what it means for the academic community. So I think so we have to start in about 2004. When Google started its book search project, it wasn't intending, at least in terms of how it held itself out, it wasn't intending to create this vast universal digital library to last forever. It rather was saying that it was scanning these books in order to index them, to make little snippets available, and then provide a link from the place where you could see a snippet to say, oh, that's a book that's relevant to my query, and then you could either check it out of a library or you could buy it from a vendor. So Google argued that the scanning of these books was fair use because it was making the books more available and linking people to places from which they could get the books. And research libraries were very keen on participating, partly because it meant that more books would in fact be more accessible and their collections would be used, besides which one of the things that Google promised was that each of the libraries that provided books to be scanned would get back a digital copy of the books in their collection, which would be good for preservation and other kinds of positive purposes. Google also had, in addition to its project with research libraries to scan their books, it had a partner program that mostly consisted of in-print books that publishers might decide that it wanted to make available for snippet or other purposes to Google's audience. So the original project then was really quite bit narrower in scope and ambition at the time. Now, the Authors Guild in September of 2005 brought a lawsuit against Google on behalf of 3 of the Author Guild members, saying that they were representing a class of all rights holders who owned rights in books that were in the University of Michigan library. So it was a class action on the author's side from the get-go. A month later, 5 trade publishers brought a similar lawsuit, and Google, as I said, was saying this is fair use. The publishers and the Authors Guild were saying that it wasn't fair use, that it was copyright infringement. So sometime about 6 months after the litigation really got started, the parties started having settlement talks. And we know from statements that some of them have made before Congress, they spent 2.5 years negotiating the fine details of this agreement. I understand that they reached agreement on the main terms very quickly, but there were lots and lots of very fine details that needed to be worked out. And so they then had this settlement from about May of 2006. And in the meantime, because Google knew that it was already had the settlement, it was just scanning books like crazy to increase the size of the corpus. So by the time we get to the settlement, that was announced in October of 2008, there's a new vision. Now Google Book Search is a universal digital library, and freely downloadable copies can be made of public domain books. In-print books are mostly going to be available through the Google Editions program. The settlement is really mostly about the tens of millions of out-of-print books that exist in the world. And Google's hope was by settling this class action lawsuit that it would get a license to essentially scan all books in copyright in the world for essentially $45 million, which is pretty cheap, actually, if you ask me. And it would be able to commercialize all of the books that were out of print unless a rights holder came forward and said to Google, don't commercialize my book. So Google then planned to provide $45 million to compensate copyright owners for the past copying of their books, $60 each. And so $45 million actually might not have been quite enough, because by the cutoff date, there were more books scanned than that. But the big deal here, right, and part of the reason why Google was saying that having a small amount of settlement money was a good thing was because of the forward-looking commercial enterprise that would be created. So you might not get that much money from your books for the scanning in the past, but boy, there's a huge bonanza out there waiting for you in the future. And there were 4 revenue models that were approved in the settlement agreement, and then 3 others that were in contemplation, at least in the amended agreement. So the initial services that Google said that they would provide is for these out-of-print books, they would make up to 20% of the contents of the books accessible by open internet searches, and run ads next to them, and then some part of ad revenues from the books that were shown would be then available to rights holders. Google also planned to sell copies, individual copies of books in the cloud, so you could access the books on Google servers, although not download them to your computer. And then, and everyone thought the biggest amount of money that was going to be available was through institutional subscriptions. So University of California would acquire a license that would allow professors and students and so forth to access the books, the kind of complete book set, and that was going to be potentially tens of millions of books, because it's pretty much it was originally thought of as something that was kind of a corpus of all out-of-print books. Okay, so that was going to be then not only licensed to colleges and universities, but also potentially some subset to public schools and to governments and to companies and so forth. So there were lots and lots of ways to kind of slice and dice the institutional subscription database and make revenues sort of an annual fee for access to these books. Now, what was planned was to create a new thing called the Book Rights Registry. And for all books that have not been signed up through the partner program, but that were commercialized, 63% of whatever Google made on those books would go to the Book Rights Registry, and less its cost would be distributed to appropriate rights holders. And there was the initial scheme called for if after 5 years people hadn't shown up to claim their books, then all the registered rights holders would get the revenues that were in the pot of money for unclaimed books. Okay, so this actually was something that the U.S. Department of Justice in mid-September said, this is a class conflict, right? Because they wouldn't have incentives to go out and really look for rights holders all that much if they were going to get all the money. And so one of the things that's different about the amended settlement agreement that was filed in November is kind of a recognition that you need to have some separate thing to do with the money for unclaimed books. Okay, so that's essentially the kind of general framework of the settlement. Then $45 million were to compensate copyright owners as to scanning in the past. $34.5 million was to be set aside for creating this book rights registry, and then $45.5 million was going to go to the lawyers, because lawyers always make out like bandits in these things. And you know, is there some irony here that the lawyers are getting more than all the authors combined? I think so. Anyway, so you can actually ask for your book to be removed, and of course you need to understand that removed does not really mean removed. It means it goes into a dark archive, and Google will probably still be making what they call non-display uses of them. Anyway, the way the class action lawsuits work is that there has to be a hearing, right? If you settle one of these class action lawsuits, there has to be a hearing at which members of the class or other entities that feel affected by the settlement can come forward and say, I object to this term, I oppose the settlement for this reason or that. And you also have a chance to opt out. So if you're a class member and you don't like the terms of the deal, then you can basically opt out, and that opt-out gives you the right, among other things, to sue Google separately or to make another separate deal with them. You don't actually have to be in the class if you don't want to. But if you don't opt out, even if you object like really strongly, you're going to be bound by the agreement if the judge doesn't insist on changes. So the first round of objections, comments, oppositions, et cetera, opt-outs was in September because the government of Germany, the government of France, and the United States Department of Justice recommended against approval of the deal. The parties basically said, oops, maybe we ought to go back and amend it. So the settlement agreement was amended in November. The next round of comments were due on January 28th, and the fairness hearing, the hearing at which the judge gives the objectors and some other parties, including the Department of Justice, an opportunity to speak about the settlement and to make their views known, and then the judge is supposed to decide whether the settlement is fair, adequate, and reasonable to the class that would be bound by it. So by sort of early September, about 400 submissions were made to the court, which is a very large number. I know it sounds like a large number, but I'm telling you, it's a really large number for a class action case. And about 95% of the submissions were critical of the settlement on one or more grounds. There were a few that were supportive. So Google's library partners made some positive statements about it. Some civil rights and civil liberties groups and disabilities groups actually spoke out in favor of it because Google is saying that it's going to make these books accessible for print-disabled people, and that's actually, of course, something that we all would like to see happen. Let me give you a flavor for the kind of for the objections. So, some were on antitrust grounds. Some were on grounds that you can't do this kind of thing with a class action. That the expansive scope of this particular settlement is far beyond the narrow issue that was in litigation, which was whether or not scanning books for the purpose of indexing them was copyright infringement or fair use. That was the issue, and yet the settlement deals with a huge range of issues that have nothing whatsoever to do with that particular issue. So one then set of concerns is whether you can use a class action to achieve such a broad change to the marketplace for books. I think that's, to me, the most serious of the issues that confronts the court. France and Germany and some foreign rights holder groups came in and said, this violates treaties that the United States is a party to, and it's anti-copyright. You have to ask our permission first, right? You don't kind of go bring a class action lawsuit and then, unless you show up and say, don't do this, that, your rights are taken away. That just seems to them outrageous. Some of the authors are also, and authors groups are upset about it because they don't think it's good enough terms, inadequate compensation, and so forth. So there are lots and lots and lots of different kinds of problems that people have raised with this. But I have a very different voice about this, okay? And part of the reason is that I'm an academic. I want access to these books, but I don't want them on any terms. Okay, so I'm going to talk about quickly 6 types of objections that I raised in the 2 objection letters that I submitted to the judge. The first submission was on behalf of 65 academic authors and researchers, and the latest one was submitted on behalf of 150 academic authors and researchers. So the first and most important to me objection is one that resonates with all the libraries, and that's that there is a serious risk of price gouging, of excessive pricing of the institutional subscription database license, because Google will have a de facto monopoly over out-of-print books that no one else can get, right? Because it's getting a license from the fiction of the settling class, right? So the class is granting a license to Google to commercialize these books and all the out-of-print books, and to scan all the books in copyright just from the class. Okay, so that's kind of an audacious move there. But nobody else can get a similar license because the class essentially is going to come into existence at the time the settlement's approved, and then it ceases to exist at the same time, right? So the class kind of lives long enough to give Google the license and then ceases to exist. So unless Congress passed a law that gave exactly the same rights, and now why, there's no reason to think that prices aren't just going to go up astronomically. And when you're talking about a corpus of at least 5 million books, probably something more like 20 million books, right? This was at least the plan. You can't imagine that they're going to make it available for $29.99, okay? And even if it starts off as a pretty low price to get people to buy into it, by the time, right, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, 30 years from now, there's no constraint on price increases, right? It just says the price will be set by Google in consultation with these author and publishers that negotiated the agreement in the first place, and they'll take into account the number of books that are in the corpus, the number of services that are available, and the prices of comparable products and services. But there are no comparable products and services, and there can't be unless Congress acts. So you give somebody a monopoly, even a Google company, if you think that they're like great people. Okay, they have a duty to their shareholders to maximize revenues, and so it seems to me that that's something that's really of concern. And so the libraries are kind of, ooh, we're worried about this too, but they are trying to say, oh, Judge, please, continue to oversee this, and don't let them price gouge us. But the truth is that what you need is something in the settlement agreement itself that provides some sort of cap about price increases, and that's the thing that I've been pressing for the most. So they keep saying, oh, we won't price gouge, I promise. It's like, I'm sorry, I don't trust you. Okay, so that would be the biggest problem to me. A second problem, and it's not unrelated, is what Carla Hesse has called the too big to fail problem, right? So by the time, right, let's assume that the happy story here is borne out, and that Google makes this database of 20 million books available to UC and to every other university and lots of other entities. And it proves to be like really, really desirable. It's like, okay, by the time we get really hooked on it, what if they decide to close it down? It's like, what if they decide they're not interested in it anymore? What if they decide to sell the corpus to China? Okay, there's one provision in the settlement agreement, 1730, that gives them a right to sell the corpus to anybody at any time without anyone else's consent. And that seems to me to be something where we as as university researchers have an obligation, I think, to our fellow academics that this digital library, the one that's supposed to last forever, that public good that we contributed to should not go away. So there needs to be a backup plan so that, for example, the libraries that now will have library digital copies of books in their collection could at some point, if other things go bad, essentially use their digital copies in order to kind of recreate a library and make the books available that way. So that's the second big one. And of course, the servers could go down, right? So think about it. If everybody in the world is like using sort of Google Book Search for their research libraries, 404, Google Books not found. It's like, what do we do then? That seems to me to be a problem too. Now, one that probably will resonate with a lot of folks here, also, if you didn't like the first two that I brought out, user privacy seems to be something that most of us can relate to, right? When we read books, it is almost like, short of sex, the most private thing that we do. And the notion that every time that you're reading a book, that someone at Google can like, hey, Pam Samuelson's reading that book now. It creeps me out, okay? And so there are dozens of provisions in the settlement agreement that call for close monitoring of reader behavior. Well, they've got to figure out how to allocate the money, right? So you need to know who used the books and how long they used the books, et cetera. But there's essentially no privacy protections built in. So if you have something that calls for lots of monitoring of very private data, and Google will just say, don't worry, we'll protect privacy. It's like, I'm sorry, that's not good enough. I want privacy guarantees built into this agreement. A fourth category of problem that I've articulated is censorship risks. And again, the libraries were really out in front on this thing. But not only can Google decide to omit from the institutional subscription database books that it has decided for editorial or non-editorial reasons should not be in the corpus. You know, when they're taken out of this quote-unquote universal digital library, they will cease to exist, right? And so the risk that Google will cave to pressure, whether from governments or from nonprofit groups, to censor books is pretty high. Another chilling part of the settlement agreement is that which gives Google power to alter the texts of the books. Now, if the rights holder has signed up, then they have to at least kind of ask your permission first. But for all of the books that are unclaimed, all they have to do is get the permission of this new thing that's going to be called the unclaimed work fiduciary. And that person has got the authority then to alter the text of the books. And I'm like, this is unacceptable to me, okay? So that's another one that I don't like very much. A fifth category of problem is that I think the settlement has the wrong solution to what I'm going to call the orphan books problem, right? So orphan works are works that even if you tried to do a reasonably diligent search for the person who owned the rights in the book, you can't do it, right? The publisher went out of business. The author went to live in the remote areas of Alaska and can't be found. There are dozens of reasons why people might not be findable with any kind of ease. And Congress has actually been considering orphan works legislation that would allow people who made this reasonably diligent search to make use of the work and make derivative works and the like, if once they've sort of said, okay, I made this search, I figured out that this thing is an orphan, I'm going to, in good faith, now use it, make it available on a website or do something else with it. And Congress, the approach that Congress has been taking in this legislation is, if you made this good faith effort, then you can go ahead and use it. And if the rights holder shows up later and says, I want some compensation, well, maybe you would have to compensate them then, but there would be less remedies against you for the uses that you'd done up to then. And so it's kind of a free use approach. If the work, in fact, is an orphan. This is not a trivial problem, because the Financial Times, for example, estimates that somewhere between 2.8 and 5 million books of the 32 million books are, in fact, orphans. Even David Drummond, the chief legal officer of Google, has said that 20% of the in-copyright books in the corpus are probably orphans. So it's millions of books. That we're talking about here, and it's likely to make up a pretty substantial part of the institutional subscription database, right? Because the rights holders won't show up to tell Google, take my book out, so Google will then commercialize the books through this kind of license that it will get from the class. So Google's then going to be able to monetize them by sort of selling them and selling the ISD and so forth. But nobody else can get a license to those things, because the book rights registry, although it can license books that have been registered with them to other people if the copyright owner says yes, they can't do it as to the orphan books, because the orphans are orphans. So only Google would be able to do that. So the current model for what to do is that Google will essentially throw the 63% of the revenues that are attributable to the kind of unclaimed books, which includes the orphan books, throws it over the wall to the book rights registry. The book rights registry is supposed to use some of that money to try to track down the rights holders and say, oh my God, I've got a check for $1,000 for you. Why don't you sign up with me, and then I'll give you that check. But they're going to accumulate millions of dollars for these orphan books. And after 10 years, if the people don't show up, the unclaimed work fiduciary is going to start becoming the biggest philanthropist in New York City. Okay, so the money is just going to be given away. So for the full term of copyright for all these books, Google will be commercializing the only one that can commercialize them. The money will be collected and then given away to the fiduciary's favorite charities. And it's like, excuse me, like, what is up with this? If after 10 years the rights holders can't be found, we should deem them to be orphans, and then say you can use the book without, right? The book should be treated as either open access licensed or in the public domain, which is the kind of approach that Congress has been thinking about for orphan works generally. So I think this is the wrong solution to the orphan works problem, besides which It's not for Google to essentially solve the orphan works problem, particularly when it's only solving it for themselves. Okay, so that seems to me to be a serious problem. And in fact, the Department of Justice in its most recent filing essentially said to Judge Chin, who is going to be conducting the fairness hearing, you don't have power under the law to approve the settlement because it's quasi-legislative in character. And if you want to make these kind of changes, the branch of the government where you do that is Congress. Finally, I will just briefly touch on another objection that I have, which is that a lot of publishers, including some of those who actually negotiated the agreement, aren't going to allow their out-of-print books in the corpus. So they're taking their books out, right? So how good of a deal can this be if, for the books that they have, they're making the side agreements with Google through the partner program and then leaving everybody else's books in the settlement? You see there's a kind of conflict of interest here. If it's such a great deal, why don't you keep your books in? That seems to me to be a serious problem. So this notion that Google Book Search is going to be this universal digital library that will last forever is an exaggeration and unlikely to be achieved through this particular settlement. So where do things stand now? As I said, Judge Chin is supposed to hold a hearing on February 18th. Whatever he decides, it will probably go up to an appellate court. And my prediction is that this thing is going to fall apart. Now, a narrower settlement could actually be created, but this kind of institutional database of millions of books that we would all like to see come to pass is something that can only really come to pass if Congress can be moved to it. And I think the university research community really could take part in persuading Congress that the public good, that a real digital library run by real librarians would be something that we all should support. So that's what I wanted to say. Thank you. I believe there is a microphone in case anybody wants to ask questions.
Hi. What do you know or suspect about, you talked about at the beginning about Google's intentions or ambitions changing considerably from 2004 to 2008. What do we know about, or at least their public posture?
Yes. Right.
What do we know about how that those ambitions evolved, and well, yeah. What do we know about how those ambitions evolved, or were they being duplicitous or a little tricky at the beginning? Number two is, what, if anything, is wrong with the class action structure, or the people who are criticizing who have criticized the settlement? If I'm right, that the objections came very late in the game, and the class action procedure only is very ill-suited to considering interests other than the class members' interests.
Good, great questions. So what do we know about Google's intentions and how they changed? The Amazon most recent brief that was filed in late January tells a story of that change. And it, at least as the public story goes, it was Richard Sarnoff from the Association of American Publishers who reached out to the head of the Authors Guild, and the two of them came up with an idea for, hey, you know, this lawsuit is going to be long and expensive. Why don't we talk to them about settling it? And wouldn't it be great if we could breathe new commercial life into out-of-print books and use the settlement in order to accomplish that particular objective? So they then made contact with Google folks and raised this with them as a possibility. And it's my understanding from having talked to the parties that they reached the basic agreement for the basic framework pretty quickly, and then spent this 2.5 years kind of working out the fine details. And that's the story that from the public record that I know. So this wasn't, at least as the story has been told publicly, that Google was secretly always intending to do this. But of course, you'd have to be a moron not to sort of understand that at some point, if you've got the text of all the books in the world, that there might be some opportunities to commercialize them. But in terms of their public statements, they've always said what we were doing is making an enhanced card catalog, not a library. That was their public posture in 2004. As for what's wrong with the class action structure, there's nothing wrong with the class action structure. And the Department of Justice is saying in its most recent filing that if this was really the settlement of the lawsuit about scanning of books for purposes of indexing them, then they think that a sensible class and a sensible settlement could be reached for that. In some measure, what we have with a Google Books settlement here is really two settlements, only one of which is really a legitimate settlement, right? So the $60 per book for scanning that's gone on in the past is damages for past infringement, right? That's what the case was about. So if they, in fact, sort of settled on something where it was basically, okay, you know, if they scan your book, you get $60, but they still only are able to do snippets, or they have to get your permission to make any more of the book available than just the snippets. That's a settlement that would be within the scope of what class action law allows, at least as long as adequate notice and other kinds of parts of the requirements for class actions are satisfied. The big part of it, right, the second part of the settlement is really the big enchilada here, right, is the commercializations thing. And that was not in contemplation in the, by Google, and they never claimed that they could do that as fair use. So what you have is taking the occasion of a lawsuit between the parties on one narrow issue and using it as leverage to essentially remake the market for digital books, which is beyond the scope of what the lawsuit was about. And so as a matter of due process, there are lots of serious questions about whether the class action can be used for that expansive purpose. And as I mentioned earlier, the Department of Justice has concluded that the court lacks the power to approve a settlement this vastly different from the issue that was in litigation.
Could I have one quick follow-up, or do you need to move it around? It seemed as if, to an outsider, it seemed as if the objections were very belated in relation to how long this whole thing developed. And to the extent that that was true, did it have anything to do with Google's good guy image or largesse in doling out money to law school clinics or civil liberties groups?
So here's the thing. None of us knew that a settlement was in the works, and in fact had been agreed to until October 28th, 2008. A little bit of awareness started to blossom kind of in March and April. I wrote a paper called The Dead Souls of the Google Book Search Settlement, which I was really proud of the title. You know the story of Gogol's dead souls, right? Chichikov goes around the countryside and buys up all the dead serfs so that the landowners don't have to pay, and then he's going to take out a loan on the he's going to take out a loan on the dead souls and then become a rich man, right? Well, in Gogol's story, the scheme falls apart, and Chichikov's is like sort of out of town on the rails. But if the settlement was approved, Google's dead souls would pay off big time because they could commercialize these millions of books. So I raised that, and then the problem. I think part of the problem was the agreement as a whole is like 350 pages long, okay, and it's dense legalese. Even I find it painful to read, and a lot of the sort of real important things are down in the subsection of a subsection of a subsection. So the sort of investment that you had to make in order to figure out what it was about, it was easier to just listen to the Google, right, and then like do a little Google dust in your eyes and kind of go, oh God, oh, more books available, isn't that going to be great? It's like, so it wasn't until people really started diving down and looking at the agreement that I think people really had some concerns. And then concerns, once there was a little bit of attention to it from the press, then more people said, my God, you mean? And so, again, I wasn't initially not that bad about this thing. I thought, I can understand why they're doing this. And of course, I didn't know anything about class actions at the time, so I've had to learn a whole bunch of stuff. But, if you kind of step back, it's kind of a perversion of the law. And the fine details of the agreement also, I think, are not so good. So that's why I'm against it.
It seems to me that the scope of this project of Google is far greater than the American legal system, and it affects the world. The idea that a corporate monopoly is going to become the custodian of the public domain is in itself insufferable. So now there are some alternatives I thought that were out there. For instance, I'm not sure of the details, but the French National Library, I thought, had some vaguely similar project that they had been working on to what Google has been doing. And do you know anything about that or any other alternatives beyond the scope of this agreement?
Well, so there are several government-sponsored initiatives to digitize books in libraries. So the Japanese Diet Library, their parliament library, is to be scanned, and they've set aside, I don't know, something like $100 or $200 million in order to do that. Korea has also decided to do a digitization project. France has announced a digitization project. There is also something called the Europeana initiative also. But of course, easy to do this as to public domain materials, but trying to do rights clearances, particularly since there are a lot of ambiguities out there about who exactly owns the rights to digitize the books or to e-book stuff. So publishers are going to say, oh, you assigned the copyright to me, so it belongs to me. But there's actually a case called Random House versus Rosetta Books, which held that authors, in fact, retained the right to control digitization and electronic book rights because it was a new and unforeseen use. And the common language in trade publishing contracts that the author is giving the publisher the right to publish the work in book form is actually a limited grant. The publishers, of course, don't like that decision, and the fact that the Second Circuit affirmed means that it looks like the e-rights might be with authors, but of course, it's a highly contested thing. So some part of what the settlement did, and some part of what it took 30 months to do, is for the authors and publishers to work out a compromise as between themselves about this. So instead of saying, well, let's fight it out in court, they kind of created this arbitration system and also kind of did this agreement so that for books that were published before 1987, the author would get 65% of the revenues and the publisher 35% of the revenues. And for things published after 1986, then they do a 50-50 split. Okay, so again, this is a kind of legislative activity, right? It's usually for Congress to decide who gets those kind of rights, or for courts, right? That's what. But this is right. This is kind of a very contentious issue, and so they tried to settle it through this particular way. So for works that are in copyright, these digitization projects really are difficult because you have to get the rights holders' permission, or you could have what I think Google was setting out to do, or at least what it said it was setting out to do initially, which is digitize the books, only make snippets available, and then provide people with links to libraries and to bookstores where they could buy the book, and that to me is a good compromise. So that would be, my preferred solution right now. So I actually like the original Google Books idea.
I would like to comment, just ask you a question about what you said about privacy. I was reading this morning in the Spanish journal El País. They were commenting on a report by Journalists with No Borders, and the report is about the enemies of the internet. And on the list of the enemies of the internet, they put Iran and China and with that use software to censor certain contents. And the last paragraph of the article talks about Google and says that Google is using the same software to open the contents of Gmail, of the people who are using Gmail. So what it says is that, like books have the card and the content, the emails have the address label, the envelope, and then the content. And Google is saying that they have to read the content and not only the label, because they're including advertisement in the Gmail, and that way that's the only way they can monitor their investment and the advertisement. So it seems that it's the books, but that Google is also doing that same step into going into the contents in their email, which is also enlarging the problem. So I wanted to hear your...
That's what they're planning to do. They're planning to service ads next to the books. So I think even for books that you purchase, because the books will be right in the cloud and not on your computer, then they can serve you new ads every time you look at the book, right? You purchase the book, but it doesn't mean that you don't get it with ads. There have been also discussions. I don't know that it's been decided yet, but the institutional subscription database, there's talk of serving ads next to that at the university. So I can understand that they'd want to run ads on kind of open internet searches, but for the research libraries and for researchers, academic researchers who are doing scholarly work, to be kind of sped ads all the time turns, as I pointed out in one of my Huffington Posts, turns a research library into a shopping mall and seems really inconsistent with the kind of the enterprise. And so Dan, when I said something about this at a conference, Dan Clancy said, "We haven't made that decision yet." And it's like, yeah, but you're talking about it. And they have reason to do this. Now, the thing is that actually books, on average, are not very good to run ads against. They also have problems with classification. So right now, Google is trying to automate kind of what category of book something is to try to help figure out what to do, what ads to serve. But some of their classification errors are really funny. Leaves of Grass, of course, is a gardening book, and a biography of Mae West, which talks about her as an idol, is under religious studies. You can imagine that books about sort of sexual identity and sexual, I don't know, practices or whatever, it's like you're going to get Victoria's Secret ads next to it. And so, there's some issues there. Yeah, that's why they want to monitor the using of the stuff really carefully so that they can serve ads. That's their business.
I've heard Google say that there's no reason that another company couldn't come through and scan books the same way that Google has. So I wonder, and it seems to me that you're saying something different. Can you talk more about that?
It's one of their mantras. They have scripts, and they really stick to the scripts, and they're really good at their scripts. But that script is wrong, and here's why. So, it is true that as a physical matter, other companies can scan books. If they scan books for the purpose of becoming a competitor with Google in the sale of individual books and in creating an institutional subscription database that they might license to universities, that would be copyright infringement. There's no way you could justify that as a fair use. So see, what happened was when Google started scanning, it had a plausible fair use argument for the purpose of scanning to index and make snippets available. but nothing beyond that, right? To make more than just these short snippets that give you kind of a sense of whether or not you're kind of in the ballpark, that would have been an extremely risky thing to do. So they had a plausible argument. But of course, if a second comer now tries to just make snippets available, that's not going to compete well against sort of making 20% of the books available on open internet searches, which is what Google will be able to do with the license that it will get from the class. So the other thing is that I think the next guy's fair use defense will be affected, and possibly negatively so, if Google settles this lawsuit, because its argument was pretty plausible when it started. But if Google settles a lawsuit, it's going to look like, to at least some people, like, well, gee, you see, they're conceding that in fact it was copyright infringement. So I think on both scores, it's a cute mantra, but it's really misleading and I think ultimately wrong.
I have two questions. One is about the Congress, and is there any likelihood that Congress is going to act on public domain definition? I mean, this has been, I've heard that this, Congress should act for a couple of years now, and universities, I think, have been lobbying a bit in libraries. So do you think that there's actually a prospect of this, or would we come out with, in fact, something like the Mickey Mouse copyright law of the 1990s that actually responded to lobbyists from commercial interests? And the second is, does this settlement have anything to do with books from the 19th or 18th century? There are full texts of books from the 19th and 18th century on Google now. Would they still be, they're not, I mean, they're public domain, they don't change, do they? Or will they be part of the subscription, or what's going to happen?
So let me answer the second one first. So books that were published before 1923 are treated as though they're public domain books. And at least for now, Google is making the public domain books that it scans available for download. They're watermarked with Google stuff, but at least they're public domain. And that's not going to change. Now, the institutional subscription database would not contain anything but in-copyright books. And the people I talked to who were kind of negotiating this agreement said that 95% of the books that they thought would be in the ISD would be out-of-print books, so in-copyright, out-of-print books. So the 19th century, 18th century stuff is all public domain, and hopefully Google will decide to continue to make public domain books available for free by download, but it doesn't have to. It doesn't have any obligation to do that, and so it could decide not to. And it's my understanding that the University of Michigan is hosting a database of public domain books from Google's collection of them, but they are bound by contractual responsibilities not to make that corpus available more generally, because Google's licensing the public domain books to Sony for its ebook reader and so forth. So there's that. As for what Congress might do, well, you just never know. If the parties that came up with this settlement are really serious about trying to make this stuff available, there could be an orphan book legislation that I think could address some of these issues. And the Department of Justice says that it's going to make itself available to help work on a legislative strategy that would help with this. So, if Google, the publishers, the authors, and everybody else supported orphan books legislation, it seems to me that it could happen.
We're just going to have one more question.
So you said something early on about disabilities rights groups having some favorable things to say at the outset of the settlement. Right. And I was just curious, is it safe to assume that there are no real and concrete guarantees or provisions, though, that Google will make the books accessible? Because the mere fact of digitization doesn't necessarily guarantee that. So in your having looked at the agreement, are there guarantees that they will not put some layer of digital rights management over the text so that they are acceptable to the visually impaired?
So there are provisions in the settlement agreement that essentially do not oblige Google to do it, but indicate Google's intentions to work to make these books accessible to print disabled persons. Exactly how it would do it is not specified. I believe that all the books will be made available, except the public domain books, with digital rights management wrappers. So I wouldn't expect the disabled to be treated any better than the rest of us in respect of DRM. But I think they'll try to make it fairly lightweight so that it's not making it too difficult to use the books. But a thing actually to recognize is that the disabled folks are not parties to the agreement. So if Google just decides not to do it, there's like no contractual obligation that they owe to any disabled group. Now that if the disabled groups, say, oh, Google, you said you were going to do this and now you haven't, that could generate some bad publicity. And I have no reason to think that they're not genuine in their desire to make it, but it also is a very clever public relations move, because when they go to Congress and they talk about the Google book settlement and how good it is for everybody, it's like trotting out the we're going to do this stuff for the print disabled and we're going to do this for these people. It's like, there's a public access terminal. Well, yeah, it's a public access terminal, but yeah, Google will charge a fee for every page that you print out from out-of-print books that are in that from the free public access terminal. And if you listen to them long enough, you find out that the real reason they're providing this public access terminal to every public library is in order to make them subscribe, because if there's a long line, then you need more than that. So then you have to get an institutional subscription. And so it's essentially buy one, get one free in reverse. So you get one free, and then you buy. Okay, so that's what the real strategy is here. Okay, well, thanks very much, folks. I appreciate your coming.